Poor man's covered calls can be a bit confusing at first, and if you've just recently started with them, you might be wondering what you should do if your short call is about to expire in the money. Because if you just leave that trade alone, you'll be forced to sell 100 shares of the stock, shares that you most likely don't own. So in this video, we're going to talk about what you should do in order to avoid that situation, and we'll talk about the biggest mistake that many people make, which causes them to lose money unnecessarily. So let's get into it. My name is Charlie, and on this channel I make videos about building wealth and achieving financial freedom so that you can free up your time to focus on the things that you truly care about. So for anyone who isn't familiar, a poor man's covered call is just a trade where you buy a deep in the money long dated call option with a delta of about 0.8 or higher. Then you sell a shorter dated call against that option at a strike price above the current price of the stock. And for selling that call, you collect a premium, which you get to keep no matter what happens from that point forward. So as the name implies, the poor man's covered call just aims to simulate a traditional covered call, but with a lot less capital, because buying that longer dated call option is going to be cheaper than buying 100 shares of the stock. And just like with covered calls, there are two scenarios that could occur by the time your poor man's covered call expires. Either the stock price stays below the strike price of your short call and the call expires worthless, or the stock price exceeds the strike price of your short call, and if you were to let the trade expire that way, you would then have the obligation to sell 100 shares of the stock at that strike price. So of course in that first scenario, when your short call expires worthless, you still own the longer dated option, so you can just go ahead and sell a new short call the following week in order to keep collecting premium. But that second scenario is a bit more tricky, because if you're selling poor man's covered calls, you most likely either don't want to or can't afford to buy 100 shares of the stock, and so in that case you can't just let your call expire in the money. Instead, what you want to do is buy back that call, then immediately also sell the long call, and if you've set up the trade properly, which we'll talk more about in a minute, you'll be profitable overall. So some people think,
well, I'll just let it expire and my brokerage should automatically exit the trade for me.
But that's not necessarily always the case. And even if they do, you'll end up losing out on quite a bit of money that way. So to explain further, your brokerage definitely won't buy back the short call for you and then sell the long call, which is what I explained that you should do. If anything, they would just exercise the long call, meaning that you'd buy 100 shares of the stock at the strike price of the long call, and then they'd sell those shares at the strike price of the short call to cover the obligation that you have to sell those shares. So at first glance, you might think,
okay, that's fine, at least I'm out of the trade.
But not so fast, because unless that long call was so far in the money that it had a delta of 100, you'll actually be losing money when that call gets exercised. And that's because when you buy a call option, it has both intrinsic and extrinsic value. Intrinsic value being the difference between the strike price of the option and the current value of the stock, and extrinsic value being basically the time value of the option. So these longer dated options have a lot of extrinsic value because they have a lot of time until expiration, whereas an option that expires today, for example, has almost no extrinsic value. And so therefore, if you exercise an option early, you're only capturing the intrinsic value of the option, and all of that extrinsic value just goes away. So hopefully that all makes sense, but just to make it even more clear, let's take a look at an example. So here I'm looking at an AMD Leaps option that expires in January of 2023, and we'll take a look at the 80 strike call, which has a delta around 0.81. Now AMD stock is currently trading at $110.72, so if we were to buy 100 shares of the stock, that would cost us $11,072. But if we instead bought that 80 strike call, that would cost us about $3,812, assuming we got it halfway between the bid price and the ask price. So then we could exercise that call, which allows us to buy 100 shares at just $80 per share, so that'll cost us an additional $8,000. So that brings our total cost up to $11,812, which is over $700 more than we would have spent if we had just bought the shares outright. And again, that's because of the $3,800 that we spent to buy that 80 strike call, only about $3,000 of that was intrinsic value, and the rest was extrinsic value, which we lost when we exercised the call. So for that reason, you should always sell your Leaps options rather than exercising them if you want to avoid losing money. And the only way to ensure that happens is to do it yourself. So with poor man's covered calls, you do have to monitor those trades on the day they expire. And if your short call is going to expire in the money, just go ahead and buy it back while also selling your long call. And of course, to ensure that you end up profitable when it's all said and done, you have to have sold a call at the proper strike price to begin with. So personally, I don't really have a hard and fast rule for that, but I just like to sell my poor man's covered calls a bit further out of the money than I would a traditional covered call. So using the current price of AMD at about $111 per share, I might sell a traditional covered call 1 to 2 weeks out at the $113 or $114 strike price. But I'd probably sell a poor man's covered call at the same expiration date 1 to 2 weeks out, but at anywhere from the $114 to $116 strike price. And the reason for that is, number one, it's just more of a hassle to close out a poor man's covered call, so I try to avoid having those expire in the money. But also, my 80 Delta Leaps option won't increase in value as quickly as 100 shares of the stock would, so selling at a higher strike price leaves me with a bit more upside. Now, there's one other scenario that I want to talk about, which is what happens when you sell a poor man's covered call, say 3 or 4 weeks out in time, and then the stock quickly and significantly exceeds the strike price of your short call. Because in that case, if the stock keeps rising, you could actually get to a point where your short call is increasing in value more quickly than your long call, meaning that the profit on that trade is actually decreasing. And that's something that you don't have to worry about with traditional covered calls, because in that case, once the stock exceeds the strike price of your short call, you've reached your maximum profit, and no matter how much the stock keeps rising, you'll still achieve that max profit. But with poor man's covered calls, you do have to keep that in mind. Although luckily there's an easy way to tell when you've surpassed that max profit, and it's just when the delta of the short call exceeds the delta of the long call. Because as you probably know, the delta value is what tells you how quickly an option will increase in value as the stock price increases. So whichever option has the higher delta is the one that'll increase in value more quickly. So again, that's just something that you have to actively monitor. If you see the delta of the short call exceed the delta of the long call, and you think that the value of the stock is going to keep rising, you're best off just closing out that trade by buying back the short call and then selling the long call. So poor man's covered calls do require a bit more maintenance than traditional covered calls, but both trades certainly have their place. And in a recent video from my Road to Financial Freedom series, I actually discussed my thoughts around when you should use each one. So if you want to see that, be sure to click that video in the bottom right corner of the screen. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you all in that next video.